All right, and we are live. Welcome back to anybody who might be watching now. In the audience, I am just going to briefly make sure that the stream is working on YouTube's end. So I do have to refresh, and there might be some background noise going on before I end up hitting the mute button. There we go. It is working. So welcome back to episode 11 now of the IndieVerse. It feels like the first episode was just a couple days ago. Today, I am so happy to be joined by Mark Johnson. Mark, it is so nice having you on. I really appreciate you coming on today and taking the time all the way across several ponds. Well, I guess, yeah, several countries and ponds in New Zealand. So thank you again so much for coming. And for anybody who doesn't know, the IndieVerse is basically a space where we talk about all things self-publishing, indie publishing, small press. So please be sure to check out all of the other episodes. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to introduce himself, and then we're going to get into all the questions I have for you today.
Great. Thank you, Keelan. So great to be here. And my name is Mark Johnson. I write epic fantasy. I'm a former high school English teacher here in Auckland, New Zealand. I write epic fantasy with elements of dark fantasy and science fantasy. My series is Firewall. It's about a fallen paladin who has to defend a god's vulnerable point from infection by demons. And the catch here is that the god is also a massive living city.
That's so cool. I right off the bat, I have a question for you that wasn't one of the ones I sent you. So,
Sure.
So you said epic fantasy with elements of dark fantasy. And I was just recently having the conversation with somebody else on the IndieVerse, and I forget who it was at the moment. I forget with whom I was having this conversation, but it was about the distinction between different fantasy genres and dark fantasy, because dark fantasy seems to be this like obscure. I was classifying some stuff as dark fantasy once upon a time, so I was curious to hear your opinion on how do you differentiate between like an epic fantasy with dark fantasy elements and a dark fantasy.
All right. Okay. So, okay, we'll go all the way to the other extreme, which is grimdark.
Yeah.
And the way I describe grimdark is, okay, it's family friendly, right? I bet, okay. Nasty people being nasty to other nasty people. That's the way I describe grimdark. And then we go all the way into epic fantasy, which is got to do with adventure. Then we go into dark fantasy, which is about dark elements, and it's not gratuitous depiction of violence and evil, but it displays the elements of human nature and human society that brings things into reality, as opposed to being just almost pornographic in its violence, the way that grimdark is. And so when I say I've got elements of dark fantasy, I start an epic fantasy, and my opening scene is some paranormal investigators stumbling into a massacre, and it's not PG.
Yeah.
But then again, we come out of it, and that's just to show what's there, and we don't need to get fully involved in it. And so that's how I described it. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. The reason I ask is because I've classified some of the stuff I've written as epic fantasy with dark fantasy elements, dark fantasy, but sometimes it just doesn't like hit in those genres. So yeah, that really makes sense. There's like the two extremes, and then there's like a spectrum in between.
Bingo.
So anyway, back to like the actual questions I had for you. Sorry for the little aside there. And for anybody who's watching live right now, if you have any questions for Mark at any time, drop them in the chat and we'll be getting to them at the end. But the first question I have for you is I just want to hear about your writing. How did you get started? What was the catalyst for you getting started in writing?
I've been a high school teacher for years, English and drama, and I was, and I'd come as far as I could, and I was like, I need more. My wife had just finished her maternity leave for our second child, and it was like, and now I was like, I need to do something different. I'm just getting so bored with the same stuff in and out every day. And I've always wanted writing. And so she said, you just go and write. I didn't ask. She said, just go, start writing. And I was like, oh, okay. And it's the best thing she ever said to me. And I actually did a master's degree, which took me on this tremendously winding, strange route to where I am now. And I don't recommend it, doing a master's degree to spec fic writers, horror, fantasy, science fiction. I don't recommend it. When I did it close to 10 years ago, it was really, really a different era in terms of technology, and there was nowhere you could really look in the same way. And especially here in New Zealand, I was like, if I was living in the US or Canada, England, I knew where to go. It just wasn't clear how to get started,
Right.
10 years ago. So I started, and I just said, right, let's do it the easy way and go back and do a master's. And I don't fully regret it, because I did graduate with honors, and I did learn a lot from the course. It's just, I think it would have been a whole lot more smooth if I knew what I knew now and I just plunged straight into the writing and made contact with editors instead.
So I almost did my master's degree in New Zealand. Just saying, just throw that out there. Yeah, in Auckland, environmental sciences. Actually, I was accepted to a program, but it was just way too expensive. I was like, can't afford. But very, very, as an international student, it was just like way out of my price range. But that is very cool. Also, basically, you're living my dream, living in New Zealand, doing a master's degree. So. Anywho, so would you say then, like, was it after the master's degree that you started kind of writing professionally, that you decided this was what you were going to pursue, or was that something that you were doing simultaneously while studying?
I got into the master's degree to focus me, to force me to put pen to paper every single day. And I also did it to figure out the territory. And by doing the master's degree, dealing with, master writers, as they say, that would put me on the right track, I guess, to where I needed to be, even though I knew that Amazon would be the way I go, writing here in New Zealand back 10 years ago. I was hoping that they would be able to put me on the path, and boy, was I wrong. The difference is that master's degrees are, by their very nature, literary master's degrees aimed at the existing literary establishment, which have always looked down their nose at speculative fiction, and that's not going to change. And I'm fine with that. I'll take our publishing numbers versus theirs at that 10% of ours any day of the week. Yep. That works fine for me. But I'm not trying to say anything bad about my instructors. It's just that they were totally out of their depth. And they would say, when I was writing structure, and they'd say, why did you do this? And I'd go, oh no, that's too trope heavy. And I'd give them this great big, because I'm a massive dork, and I'd explain exactly, why I couldn't do that in the genre. And they'd sit back and they'd scratch their heads and say, all right, you're the boss. You know more than I do. And I was like, I was wanting them to push back on me and give me context, and they couldn't. They just didn't have enough sci-fi, fantasy, horror knowledge, and I got frustrated. They're very knowledgeable, very capable, very good at what they do, but I was just this outlier that they did their best for.
That's so. I mean, I can imagine, like, it's just they're an expert in their craft, but the craft that they are experts in is not your craft. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you mentioned, Amazon, but I do understand that you did start with a small press, I believe.
Yeah.
So what was your journey like getting there, and how was your experience? How did you kind of get started in that small press area?
Right. Well, we have to backtrack a little bit, because 10 years ago, it was the publishing companies in New Zealand were just absolutely falling apart, and they were fall into the state where they are now, which is basically the Amazon revolution and the Kindle, which changed everything. So many people in New Zealand have Kindles simply because, as you'll understand, transporting a book from the publishing houses and the printing houses in China or in the US or in England, the cost is phenomenal. And we come out here and, to buy, this is my book, but I'm just saying, to buy a book this size is 25 to 30 New Zealand dollars. And when the minimum wage is around $20, that really tells you what that means. To buy a book is a really, really huge investment in New Zealand, and that's why it's more of a gift. And at the same time, children's fiction and non-fiction is booming. It's great. It's absolutely great here in New Zealand. It's never been better. But for fiction books of all descriptions, it's just falling apart. And there was only one New Zealand publisher by the time I did my master's degrees in New Zealand. And it wasn't even a New Zealand publisher. It was Random House and Penguin merger. And they had an office here in New Zealand, and there were rumours that was going to be picking up and leaving as well and going to Sydney. So the whole scene was just terrible. And our instructors would sit around the table and they'd say, "Hey, good luck, guys. Your work is beautiful, but good luck." And so a bunch of us grads sat around and say, "Well, let's take the fight. Let's take the fight to them, and let's form our own publishing company." And we made a publishing company based on the grads of the program, and the idea came from the right place. However, from the start, the seeds of our destruction were involved because spec fic, for example, historical fiction, and for me, fantasy fiction versus the literary, we had two completely different goals in mind. The literary people really wanted to be involved in the scene, and the spec fic, the historical fiction, they and me, we really wanted money and to make a living and these kind of things, and totally different goals. And it was never really addressed, and it was difficult to. And I could only see that really when I stepped back, and I was just like, it's so obvious. Why can't we need to do X? Why are they insisting on doing Y? And it was only when I left that I realized it all fell into place. I'm like, and and there's nothing wrong with them wanting that. There's nothing wrong with me wanting what I want. And it just took so long for me to realize it. And I was just so in the moment with all the books that I was editing, with all the books I was working with designers on. And all these processes, and then everything else works so well when we're all making the machine work, and then we stand back and we realize that we've got completely different goals for the vision. And I don't know what they're up to at the moment. Every now and then I hear some from my friends who are still there, and in some ways they're doing quite well, but in some ways they're doing the exact same thing. And it's if I could do it all again, what I would do is try and separate the lit fic from the spec fic, and so that our goals were all matching. Because a lot of money was poured down the drain. A lot.
Well, it sounds like two completely valid goals, just pulling in kind of opposite directions. And
I mean, no hard feelings. I mean, they were good at what they did, and we were good at what we did. It's just that when you try to merge them together, it just became this abomination that could not get off the ground. And so I learned a lot from that experience as well. So lengthy and expensive, but got some experience from it, which is also good.
That's super interesting. I feel like Canada, we have big publishers in Canada, but they're basically satellite offices of the big publishers in the States. And then other than those big publishers, we just have small presses. Like there's not there's not like there's not a kind of massive Canadian publisher, I don't believe, that isn't head office to like in the States, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Perfect sense.
yeah. So I
Oh,
understand.
and New Zealand small presses, there are a few. If they're not children's fiction, a lot of them are funded by the government, and it's just a pure it goes from government to it might as well be a governmental office, all these presses. I'm
Right.
to the point, and I've been saying this for years, that the New Zealand literary industry should be burned to the ground, simply so that something better, Phoenix-like, can rise from the ashes. Because at the moment, it's just a rot. And I'd speak to the politicians involved with the arts funding, and they're quite, and it's not their specialty. They don't know what's going on. They're happy to delegate to experts in the field, and the experts in the field are so invested in proving that the industry is not dead that they'll go to any lengths to prop up their friends, and it just becomes this. I'm not calling it conspiracy, and I'm not saying that the people are rotting the system deliberately for their own benefit. It's just that they care so passionately about the industry that they can't see what's best to just maybe pull the plug on the pull the plug.
Yeah.
For
It's always hard though when there's something you're so passionate about. I totally understand where they're coming from, because they don't want to see it die, but I get it. Sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to let it, like you said, burn to the ground so something better can rise from the ashes.
Exactly, because it's books. There'll always be more books. Something will always happen.
Yep. So you did make the decision to switch then to self-publishing.
Yes.
I'm sure there were lots of considerations in making this decision, but if you could summarize, like, what was it, I guess, what was the catalyst for you making this switch?
It was just the inertia, and it was just the tensions were boiling over, and we were not making headway. It was just like this book, we had a couple of books get awards. We were making some good stuff, beautiful award-winning stuff about New Zealand history, or about stuff that sells like wildfire in the regions where the book is set, and those get awards, or stuff about the life of Michelangelo and focusing on his painting of the Sistine Chapel, of the ceiling, no, sorry, of the nave, of the nave, and writing amazing stuff, but not being able to get further with it. And it was coming clearer to me that it was this competing visions of what we wanted to do with that. And and one side would bolster the flailing New Zealand fiction industry and become leaders in what that fiction could be, and be the guiding light. And the other side, my side, was like, let's create a powerhouse of money and influence, and it was just two completely different goals. And I realized that I might as well just get out of the way. And because I'd starting doing more and more research on Amazon as I was getting closer to publishing, doing more and more research on Amazon and how to get influence, doing the 20K to 50 groups. 50, I butchered that. Mark Dawson.
So good though. Yeah. 20 books to 50K. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, 20 to 50K. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. And I did all these things. And I'd come to these meetings on, we need to do this, and we need to do this, I need to do this. And it was just, they were just staring at me like I'd just grown a third eye in my forehead and horns, and it's just, I think Mark's gone crazy. And it's just, I'm just talking another language. And I realized it was time to go. It was, I knew what I was doing better than they did, but
right.
It was time for me to go. Because I knew what was needed for me, and there you go. It was time to go.
Well, it sounds like you also had an interest in kind of the businessy things, because you were the one bringing it to the table. And I feel like that's something that switching to self-publishing, a lot of folks maybe don't consider, but you were already in all those groups. So
yeah. Exactly. And because they were starting to, my friends were saying, let's not publish, let's not self-publish because then it looks like we're just publishing rubbish. And absolutely, there is that stigma with self-publishing. But some of the books I see published by big publishers are not what I would call brilliant books either. They still put out fails as well. And yes, the ground we were trying to make, and where I feel the best territory is going forward for the industry, is in small little indie presses that have a range of talent within them. Someone who's got a handle on the advertising, someone who knows how to edit, someone who can structural, developmental, line and proofread, and have a bunch of talent who are willing to push a work from here to here. And I think that is the way forward. And you have whichever press going, whichever name you have, and you focus on a particular genre, be it from grimdark or to noble bright, whatever. And that is your jam. You are vampire romance or whatever you are, and you just push that, and people start chasing your company brand, and other authors emphasize the company brand, and people will flock to you like wildfire, and it'll really, really work. I think that is the way forward. I can't find that here in New Zealand,
right?
Because obviously we're too small, and the industry, as you say, is just a very, very funny place, especially in a limited market like New Zealand. So for the time being, I'm going to be self-pubbing.
Almost like, it kind of sounds like, just listening to the way you describe like self-presses, like very small indie presses, it almost sounds kind of like a publishing type collective where you get all these people with these different skills, and then it's an exchange of services to advance a collective goal.
Exactly. That's exactly, a collective is probably the best word. And because with being self-pub, there's so much admin, and that's how I divide my day. I do my morning. I'm not a morning person.
Yeah.
I spend my morning doing admin so that once I've got the kids home and fed and all the rest of that, then I can bang out my 2,000 words a day. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I'm sure like with self-publishing, there's so much that goes into time management, which kind of brings me to my next question. So a lot of folks that watch this channel, myself included, are either like new authors, aspiring authors, etc. So I was curious, when kind of considering, should I go the more traditional small press route, or should I go the self-publishing route? What factors would you recommend people look at when making that decision?
Okay, flashing red light. Don't take this away. If you don't take anything else away, there are cowboys out there. There are cowboys. There are people who will tell you they are expert publicists. Like this one particular one based here in New Zealand. No names, can't give names, but con people. They're out there to make a buck, and they convince themselves that they know what they're doing so that they can sell it to you. They write a list of things that they think they're good at, and then they sell themselves as geniuses, and there are cowboys galore out there. Some of them know they're cowboys, and some of them convince themselves they know what they're doing, and they're just making stuff up. And you can see, I would talk to other small presses, and they would say, look at this person, what they gave us. And I'm like, I could have written this. And that's when I realized that so much hype is just, so much reputation is just built on self-hype,
right?
Especially. And this is the reason why, because of this massive crash that happened about 10 years ago, that all these people got out of the industry. All these editors who were working at publishing houses, they went indie, not because that was the trend, but because they got fired.
Right.
They lost their job. And into the void came all these newbies who said, you know what, I'm not a bad writer and I love reading books. I would be a brilliant editor. I would be a brilliant publicist. I would be a brilliant everything. And it's just, looking back on it, it's cringe. It's just there is cowboys, and I will tell anyone getting into the industry thinking about going trad, unless you're with one of the big five or an offshoot thereof, be very, very, very suspicious. And if do your research, look at all these people's books, and see how, research the authors, do your research. And there are some really good small presses out there. Also, check how much they qualify for government grants. If there's a huge amount of government grants going on there, just run. Don't go anywhere near them, because the government has to approve. And if you are not one of those ticked boxes, you won't get it. If you are a ticked box, it implies that you're not going to sell a lot of copies. So there's so much risk out there that if you got an in with a traditional publisher or one of the many offshoots, go for it. Trad, indie trad, tread very, very carefully. Just assume you're going to get burned at every step.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I never considered looking at, because the Canadian government also offers grants. I'm not sure if they offer grants to publishing houses. I'm assuming they probably do, because they do offer grants to writers. So it's interesting to hear that, looking out for the government grants, because that's an indication that I suppose the publishing house isn't doing that well financially. I don't know.
That's exactly it. And it's the too big to fail ethic. It's not too big to fail. It's too important to fail. You can't let a national airline fail, because it's just not possible. You can't allow it. But socially, you can't say it doesn't matter if our literary arts fail, and that's fine. We can't allow them to fall apart. But with an airline, that causes significant damage. With a literary, it'll be born again easily. People will always want to write more, but you can't explain that to a politician of either side of the spectrum. You couldn't explain that. They wouldn't believe you.
That's interesting. I've never heard that advice before, but that's a really interesting perspective. So I guess my next, follow up to that is you made the switch kind of from the small press to self-publishing. What was the thing you found most challenging when making that?
The admin. It's the admin, the setting up. It's setting up my own business. That was because I'm not a self-published author. I've created my own business through which I self-publish. There's no distinction there, but there is a technicality for tax reasons. So the difference is that that's a massive question.
Well,
Can you ask it in a different way? I'm like,
I mean, I guess you said, admin is most challenging. So, I mean, what's your least favorite part about admin? Is it emails? Is it taxes? Is it?
Definitely dealing with the government, especially because when they say that, by the way, you didn't trade last year, so you're on our watch list. I'm like, no, of course I didn't trade. I set the business up because I was preparing everything because I've got a 2-month release schedule, boom, 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 and it's working. It's happening now, and I'm having sales. But they don't understand that when you try to, pick up the phone and talk to Mr. Taxman and say, oh, this is why I don't need to be on a watch list. I'm legit. It's another situation of, am I talking to a sane person here? So
right.
And plus part of the gig economy, that's going to become more and more common. That's one thing I've found. Another part with setting up a business, a self-publishing business, is there's no one to fall back on other than yourself. If I used to be able to say to other people, I'm really struggling with this. I can't look at it the same way anymore. I want someone else to pick it up. And they would say, yeah, absolutely, I'll do this for you. Whereas it's just me. It's just me. And every now and then I'll go to my wife and say, is this working? Does this make sense? And she'll say, yeah, try this. But you're responsible for whether you fly or die. And that's the rough part of it.
Mm-hmm. For sure. It is. Yeah, it is. You're entirely responsible for whether, I like that saying. I've never heard it before, fly or die. But yeah, so true. So true. So, I mean, it seems like you're liking it now, but are you liking it now?
I
Self-publishing?
am liking it now. It's that independence that
Mm-hmm.
I like and that I love. I don't have to go to these massive 3-hour meetings, strategy meetings any longer. I hate meetings, and that works for me. And plus, I know what I need, and I know where I need to go. And I can't rely on other people, but I gained enough experience that I know that I can get there anyhow. So there are definite cons, absolute very clear cons, but the benefits, they do outweigh them. So I'm very pleased to be where I am.
Nice. Well, I'm glad to hear that. It's always good to hear that people are happy doing what they're doing. I only have a couple of questions left, so I just want to remind everybody watching live now that if you do have questions, please let us know in the chat and we will get to them. But the next question I have for you is any advice. Like I said, a lot of folks are either newly published or about to publish, or they're thinking of publishing. So any advice that you would have to new and aspiring authors?
Yes. Now, I would advise people, if you're the type of person who can't help writing, go for it. I used to run a blog that I even kept privately that I didn't publish, simply because I love writing, and I would write whatever was felt needed to be said. So write if you feel that need to write, but more important, you have to go out and get some life experience first, because go out and get that life experience, whatever it is, wherever it is you are, because you'll have good bosses, you'll have bad bosses, fall in love, fall out of love, you'll gain amazing friends, and you'll lose those amazing friends. You'll watch people you love not take your advice and ruin their own lives, and then you'll watch them pull back and pull it back as well. And that's all stuff that that's all wisdom. It can't be passed on through knowledge. It's got to be lived experience, and that comes out in writing. It's just so obvious. If you feel you have to write, man, you go ahead and you write and you figure out the craft, but get some life experience. It's more important that you get that life experience so you can talk about what's real and pass on wisdom, and your readers can feel what's in your books. Rather than, if I imagine what I tried to write when I just left university, what I thought the universe was, how I thought reality worked. Again, cringe. You need that experience, whatever your experience is, to go out there and make those mistakes so that you can bring that wisdom to your books. So there's no hurry. There's no hurry to get published. Your books aren't going anywhere. Write them and set them aside and come back and re-edit them with all your wisdom all those years later. You're in no hurry to succeed. You've got your life. And if you love your craft, it will work out for you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great piece of advice, especially considering there seems to be such a push in self-publishing now with like the fast releases, and fast releases are a great strategy, but that's a lot of pressure on new authors, like you said, who maybe need to go and get have some just experiences before putting these out. So yeah, I think there's a right time for everyone. Who knows what that time is for each individual person, but I really like that, because I also value, do many things outside of writing, and I value those things, and I think they like trickle their way through. So it's really nice to hear that. And I have one last question for you. I'm going to do another call out for any questions. I see there's folks watching live, so if you're watching live, please drop a question in the chat if you have any. But my last question for you, Marr, is if you could go back to the day before you published your first book, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
I'm only about 4 or 5 months in, so that's I'm not all the way there yet. But I'll tell you one thing I do know now is just do something every day that's publicity based, if not explicitly publicity, then leading towards the admin side or getting out there. You don't have to put out a tweet or a Facebook post or an email every single day. You have to do something that leads toward that to do it. And because it's tough, it's scary trying to put yourself out there amongst the masses. And I would say, keep at it, something every day, don't stop.
That's great. That's a great piece of advice. And I like the publicity side of it, because it's true. That's kind of something you have to be putting yourself out there. I really totally agree with that. Anyway, Marr, it was so lovely having you on today, and I'm just still so jealous that you're in New Zealand. But yes, it was so lovely having you on, and unless there's any questions that pop up in the next couple minutes, I'm just going to turn it over to you to tell us about what you're currently writing, new releases that you have coming out, and just so everybody knows, if you want to check out Marr's website and books, it's all linked down below. So I will turn it over to you, Marr.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. My book, The Renegade Within. Oh, it's not backwards. So often I get on the get on the screen and the writing's all backwards. Is The Renegade Within, Mark Johnson. It's about a paladin who is charged with keeping a secret from getting out into the public about a forbidden experiment that she did, and she has to chase infected people who've been infected by the experiment to a different land. And then she finds out that her superiors have been keeping a deeper, darker secret from her this entire time, and she's got to figure out what she's supposed to do about her quandary. Is she going to go, how does she bring this to light? And how, if her organization is the organization that defends against the darkness, what if that is also falling into the darkness? What is her choice? What does she do? And she's left with some moral and plot quandaries. And the whole story itself is about the defense of a vulnerable god that is also simultaneously a living city. And I did get a master's degree, strangely, also in town planning, which follows.
Feeds right in, yeah. That's so fun. I mean, it's such an interesting concept, and I see people in the chat. Eva is saying, "Ooh, I love paladins." So yes. So you have also 3 books that are coming out soon.
Right.
Is that...
I've got a free book that's out, just Amazon. I've got The Renegade Within, book 1.
Yep.
Shadows and Fog, book 2 is out, and book 3, The Night Princess, is hitting Amazon. It's going to be released in, I'd say, 3 days here. 3 days on Friday. I can't tell if that's Friday in New Zealand or Friday US Canada, but it'll be one of those Fridays, and it'll be all yours on Friday.
Aren't time zones so fun? They're like time travel.
Well, I'm here in the future, and I can tell you, everyone's still got COVID.
Yeah. Well, that's sad to hear, but I'm glad, like we were discussing before this, New Zealand's coming out of lockdown, so that's great.
Yeah, bright side to everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining today, Marr. I really, really appreciate the time. Everybody who is watching right now and who's watching in the future, you can check out all of Marr's links down in the description box below, so make sure you head on over and check out his books. And with that, that wraps up episode 11 of the IndieVerse. Thank you so much again, Mark. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who came and watched and chit-chatted, and everybody who's watching now.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everyone.